Walker, welcome back to the show. We previously talked on the first Dune. We were here talking about Dune Part 2. Can I just say, to start things off, first and foremost, congratulations on winning that Oscar for the first film.
Yeah, hey, I know that was a lot. That was a hoot.
Well
um,
deserved.
thank you very much. Yeah, that was a fun evening. I think most people will probably remember the Oscars that year for um, Will Smith's striking performance, but maybe not my speech. But it was
You gave one
tremendous
of the
fun.
funnier speeches that night, I remember, actually. And I was so grateful that people were there to film it inside the auditorium because that was also the year where they were like shortening speeches for the telecast. So in any
Yeah,
event,
they it was so ironic. They cut my speech down on the
yeah,
live, and but I'm very glad they put the full thing up on YouTube. So I direct your listeners in that direction.
exactly. Well, it was well deserved. I'm curious to know when a moment like that happens and you know you've got part two on the horizon, does that do anything to your psyche at all? Of man, I have a lot to live up to right now. I hope I can, you know, meet that expectation.
I'm sure that that feeling is felt by everybody on a film. Particularly, we're moving towards a June Messiah next year, so the same pressure applies. But that pressure applies on every film.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's a different situation. When you have the a huge amount of adoring fans for this show that you want to live up to their expectations, of course. But it's very focused on the work and kind of we know what we're doing. Denny normally sits, on the black sofa there with a strong coffee, starts the day, and we get to it. And June Part Two was no different. It was just very, very focused and hard work. But gradually the roadmap became very clear.
Can you tell me about straddling the fine line between crafting something that is ultimately a big action spectacle, but has to also balance some really intricate character work and has to slow its narrative down to allow the audience to feel the themes that Frank Herbert's original text is providing?
We had the great benefit that I think a lot of the hard work of establishing the worlds is done in part one, and it
Hmm.
meant that we were freer in a way to lean into the action and this sort of intimate human relationships at the heart of an epic battle, kick-ass
Yeah.
battle. That was the concept. But I mean, an example of that is that in part one, I think a big part of the preoccupation in the edit was to develop a sort of inner world for Paul. Very much, the kind of work we were doing in Arrival that, you could really get a glimpse of what somebody's feeling and the kind of mood of how the world appears to them internally. And we spent devoted a huge amount of time to that, and things like the voice, for example. It's partly an editing thing and partly a sound thing, and all of that world overlaps. I'm in the still point of the turning world in terms of all of the departments: art department, VFX department, sound department, music, and performance. The great
Yeah.
thrill of cutting these pieces together. But I think it liberated us. I mean, all of those things are in part two, but we could be very epigrammatic and efficient about them. Not to, repeat ourselves, I suppose. But for example, Lady Fenring uses the voice on Fade and tells him to come to the other side of the room, and we just do it gently. It's subtle, and people who know the first film will know what the process is, but enjoy the kind of brevity of the statement. So I kind of, there's a little Easter egg where Paul talks about he uses his hand to say that he's seeing all these alternative paths, and he sees one slim path, and then you just have a tiny little flash to the resolution of the Fade Paul fight. So it's 1.5, 1 second and 13 frames. It didn't need to be elaborate. But to talk to your larger point, the book is very much, the thing I think Denny has really set out to do is to elevate the, the story of the Bene Gesserit and the machinations of their plans, and but also it's a human story on a huge landscape, and that we were digging in very much more to the Fremen world and the kind of rules of a new tribe, and with our kind of central character at his lowest ebb at the beginning of the film, his tribe, the Atreides, abandoned and or dead, and in the company of increasingly deranged mother, pregnant. It starts from such a low point, and we did a lot of work in the edit to try and make that trajectory to go from him in that situation to being a potential leader of the Fremen and a messianic figure as he triumphantly stands on a worm to their applause. That took a lot of shaping. My take on all this is we wanted to lean into the action big time and to create a kind of kick-ass battle, but that means nothing. A sword fight means nothing if you don't care for the characters
Yeah.
at the heart of it. And, a lot of the work that we did, me and Denny, was just finessing the intimate moments between Paul and Stilgar, Paul and Jessica, Paul and Chani, above all else.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most remarkable things about Dune Part One and now Part Two is how they both work as standalone films that you could watch separately. But what I haven't had a chance to do this yet, but what I really want to do at some point is I just want to watch them back to back as a epic 5 hour, 15-minute single sit down. And the thing that I find most incredible is that I believe, structurally speaking, in terms of how the narrative plays out, you could literally mesh these together and release a 5 hour, 15-minute cut. And I do think the story arc and the moments where you're editing ratchets up, and then the moments where it slows down, it all feels like it's part of one piece. So you were able to create what could work as one standalone 5 hour, 15-minute film and two and a half hour long films. I don't know how the heck you guys did it, but you managed to do that somehow.
Well, I mean, the challenge of that is that nothing was shot. Dune Part One was a intense 100 and something day shoot, and I think it would have killed everybody if we'd tried to shoot elements for Part Two. So it was, just clever, on
Yeah.
Denny's part, and the screen, writing was of Part Two was so kind of tight and clever, and we fitted into a plan. But it's true, the scene begins with a vision of the Paul's little Paul's little sister, and it's a as a fetus, and then it's the next scene. It could be only a few hours after we left off Part One. They go into the
Right.
sunset, and we wake in an eclipse, and it should absolutely carry on. It's one book,
And
and
the fact that you guys shot it at two different times, but that there's visual continuity, there's editing continuity in terms of your style of what you carried over from the first one. Like it's a seamless, and I haven't seen this really executed before. I've seen it like with Lord of the Rings where they were all shot at the same time. That makes perfect sense. But to see a production that literally started, stopped, took some time, came back later, and for it to be this seamless, I think that's all around remarkable. That it
it's
feels like it's
kind
all
of
part of
remote.
one whole, you know?
Yeah, well, it's this, I think it helps that it's exactly the same team,
Yeah.
Patrice, Greg, Denny, most of all, Johnny
Hmm.
Spates, that and us in editorial and Hans. I mean, it's a kind of continuity. But yes, it's remarkable. I mean, things like, some decisions were made on Part One that, of course, massively affect Part Two. And here's an example to credit the makeup department. We had to have a vision of Jessica in the end of Part One, and she's sitting in a Fremen sitch, and she has the tattooing on her face, the kind of Bene Gesserit creed, if you like, on her face, and it's a vision where she's has a knife in front of her, and it's right towards the end of part one. And of course, it was a late, it was a late addition to the shoot,
Hmm.
part one, but that decision ahead of even a script or a storyboard or concept art for the Fremen and for the makeup design was kind of very, that was great planning.
I agree.
And one of the things that is always a tell when you're picking up a film 2 years later, and I've been involved with a film where there was a long gap between episode one and two of something, and the giveaway is often hair and makeup, and people, look older.
Yeah. Can't change that.
So yeah, it's one's eyes on that all the time.
Hmm. So, in talking about these visions, this is something that I wonder if you and Denny go back and forth on this a lot is how do you avoid revealing too much that it almost spoils something for the audience versus giving them just enough that they're like, I don't know what that is, but I'm sure it'll play a role later on.
Yeah, I know it's a consideration, right? I mean, but
Hmm.
in a funny way, I think there's some, I love that in films where there are little, I wouldn't say Easter eggs, but there are kind of little markers on the path. You're on this epic path with Paul.
Yeah.
And in fact, some ingredients of the end, the resolution of this part two, are seeded in part one. And that is down to the cleverness of, for example, the stunt director, Roger. There was this little seed that's in the first fight we ever see with Paul training with Josh Brolin's character, and it ends with he thinks he's gonna kill him, and Gurney says, look down, my lord, I would have
You
taken
would have
you.
joined me in death. Yep. Yep.
And isn't that a precursor in some way of the kind of finale, the battle between Fade and
100%.
it's so clever. And I had so many things, little loose things that you could play with in the kind of iconography of this film that sort of show you the measurement of the path. It's something I have to say, a different filmmaker, but with 12 Years a Slave, I've kind of learnt the value of that you could use things as a marker to kind of see where a character progresses by repeating and echoing images. And, one very strong one in Dune, of course, is the use of the hand, Paul's hand in water, Duke Atreides' hand on the back of Jessica's neck. They're all, that hand in water is such a kind of strong one because it always feels like the precursor of a major change. It's just on the eve of the Atreides, getting on the path, traveling to Arrakis, and later it's a transitional moment. It's a transformative moment where Paul realizes to fight the Harkonnen, he has to be a Harkonnen.
Right.
And so I don't know. There's many tools to the editing department that help you tell the story in a very visual way, and I always love that with Denny's films.
And as somebody who's read Dune Messiah, I'm not going to get into it here, but I know you guys were already thinking about laying the groundwork, obviously, and I'm very excited to see how that all plays out later and for audiences to experience it for the first time because that book is a beast. That book is a really, really tough one to crack. But moving away from that, over to Harkonnens really quick here. Fade Rafa, one and done character. He gets introduced here. He exits in this film as well. But he doesn't get introduced until about like right over the hour mark or so in this movie. I'm curious to know, was there ever a conversation or trying out like introducing him a little earlier and maybe kind of cross-cutting his story with Paul's to kind of show the parallels between them? Or was it always, no, we're going to introduce him like at the midway point of the film?
We changed the plan. It was that was one of the kind of big things that we, you know, played with on the timeline, on the Avid timeline. It was originally a little bit more intercut. I mean, what's really interesting about those two characters is that you have to have them face each other and to give huge credence to the danger of Fade and Paul's abilities pitted against that. So in some way, they have to be equal.
Yeah.
And to do that with a character that is new to this film is that's the challenge. But first of all, we've got Austin Butler doing it, and it was the very first material I received was Fade stepping into the arena, and it did. They took this angelic guy and made him look like Fade is kind of extraordinary. That was the very first thing that was shot in Budapest. But the point is that in the story, I suppose he's marked as being a prospect for the Bene Gesserit. And there's, some subtle stuff, but it's all there where, he says to Lady Fenring, I've dreamt of you. And there's a suggestion that they're in his head already, and that they may well be in his DNA. So that kind of concept that you have the rise of two people who are going to face off is that's part of the script. It's part of the story, and we kind of calculated that the best way to do that was to give Paul, a longer throw at this sort of tectonic plate moving from him being this vulnerable kid abandoned in the desert, his entire tribe destroyed, and in the company of Jessica with her machinations, and to go from that all the way to him being this proto messianic figure on atop a worm. It felt like it was better to kind of like follow that path. It was intended to be more intercut, but then you can see Fade's rise from being this psychopathic playboy to being a potential emperor, and the sort of the machinations on one side of the Bene Gesserit and the machinations of the Baron on the other, and the Emperor. So it's kind of it felt like that was its best path. I mean, I know that it meant to some adjustment. We had to kind of like get used to a different pattern, but I feel the pattern worked. It felt like you were on a very strong pulling rope, if you like,
Yeah.
editorially and in terms of momentum and story. So that was the choice, and it was to kind of establish Paul as this, messianic figure, but facing the difficulties of negotiations with his mother.
Yeah.
And then flipping to, Fade's rise from psychopath to emperor or near emperor.
And one last question before we wrap up here. I remember some people, I was talking with some folks who were anticipating like the final battle scene would be like this like epic 20-30 minute long sequence. And I was like, no, 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 no. It's supposed to be lopsided. They're supposed to completely crush them. That's why it's over in like 4 or 5 minutes, whatever it is. But I'm just curious to know, was there other material for that final scene that was taken out to reinforce that fact?
It went to the plan. It went to plan.
Oh, it
I
did.
think
Okay.
it was always, I mean, actually, to this degree, one of the kind of great compliments that Denny gives me as an editor is that he doesn't necessarily mess with things that are working exactly the way that we want them to.
Hmm.
And it was very interesting. For example, they shot Fade and Paul, the sword fight, over a couple of weeks. It was a complicated shoot with, given that there are so many characters in that
Right.
room, and that each have their kind of moment. And at the middle of it is this sort of ferocious fight, which they'd spent many, many weeks preparing for. So cutting that, I had a lot of material, and it was about, I think I had a sort of, I broke it down into chunks so I could look at little bits of the fight and kind of focus on which of these moments I was going to include. But the shape was there right from the start, and Denny never really changed anything in that fight. It was pretty much, it was one of those kind of blessed moments in the shoot where it was coming towards the end of his time in Budapest, and the whole main unit was going to move over to the desert, and we were going to stay in Budapest and receive the material from Abu Dhabi and Jordan and carry on. But it was a moment of parting for me and Denny. And it was my little gift that I just went to kind of, I just really, really got this scene together well. And it was brilliant material. It's just brilliant material to work with. And I showed it to him. and we danced because it was like we've got the end of the film, and with the material that came in later for Chani, riding off, it just felt like the formula is just working perfectly here. And honestly, Denny pays me such a great compliment in that because we knew it worked and we knew that we had an ending. It's always great to know that you have a great ending. I would just say, as corollary to that, I remember a moment with Hans when we were working on Dune Part One, which is that the very first piece of music, we heard all the kind of ingredients and the pieces and the concepts and the massive of recording that he did and the special instruments that he designed for it. But actually, the first fully orchestrated, fully produced piece of music that we heard was the end. And it was kind of rather a brilliant stroke of Hans's to say that's where we've got to get to. And I felt that same way with the fight of saying that's where we end up. And all of these beautiful beats between, Stilgar, seeing his face collapse when he thinks it's all over, that dream is gone, or Gurney in this sort of, beautiful paternal sense that he has. And Jessica, of course, all these little beats, and of course Irulan
Yeah.
and Charlie. It all came together, and we didn't have to mess with it. We spent our concentration on the things that needed more work.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think, everything that's happening before that, the big battle aspect outside, it's like that's, that spectacle, that's fun and all, but it is about this scene and that is the real main event. And so I see exactly what you're saying here in terms of that's where the energy and the focus and the time mostly lies. And I think the end result came out fantastically.
Thank
Obviously, the
you.
world responded in kind, and I have no shame in saying this out loud. I've seen this film 10 times. I'll probably see it many, many more at this point. Um,
Wow.
I I adore what you guys have done with both of these films. And as a lifelong like Dune fan, it's been a dream to see it brought to the screen in this way. So thank you, Joe.
Well,
Truly.
this is the joy of all this, Matt. You can actually tell me what I did better than I can. you know, no, I love your passion for it. And I'm so glad, that's the thing. We're just all about finding a really kind of efficient way of expressing our passion for the ideas in the film. And to kind of, in this film, we have this great opportunity, if you don't care for the characters, then the big epic battle scenes with worms and everything else going on, with nuclear explosions. If you don't care for the characters, you've got nothing. You've just got frenetic activity.
Right.
And I love that there's that balance of the little intimate human story on this epic landscape, and with a kind of kick-ass fights.
Well, all I can say is good luck with Doom Messiah. You're going to need it. But I know you guys will do the best that you can, and I'm sure it'll be fantastic. Joe, congratulations, and thank you for the time once again.
Cheers, Matt. Always a pleasure.
Take care.